This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. The subject is television westerns. I will be speaking with Henry Park and Patty Sheen about it, and the conversation will begin in a moment. The subject is television westerns. I'm speaking with two people who have blogged and written a lot about that subject, Patty Sheen and Henry Park. I'd like to just get a little background information from each of my participants. So let me ask you, Patty, if you could tell me a little bit about yourself, tell me a little bit about your blog, and what you've been writing about all these years.
Well, good morning, Dan, and thank you for inviting me to the show. Well, I guess I'll start out by telling you all that I was born and raised out on the South Shore of Long Island. The way that I ended up coming to Colorado, I had a passion for Colorado from the time I was really young and watching Gunsmoke. And I was working as an RN at a VA hospital and didn't really have a whole lot of expenses because I lived on station and didn't drive and had all this money, so that when it came time for a vacation, I came out here to Colorado on a pack trip, 11 days in the San Juan Mountains, and enjoyed the state so much that I got a job at the VA out here in Fort Lyon, which is on the southeastern plains. My writing career is basically kind of a second type of a career thing. I really am not well known as a writer. I've written a couple of things that have been accepted in anthologies. I have about 3 novels sitting here inside of my computer waiting to be finished that are kind of historical and contemporary Western type stories, because that's what I enjoy. I do my own radio show. It really doesn't have anything to do with Westerns. It's called A Step Into the Light. It's on Blog Talk Radio. It has to do more with writers. So, but as far as Westerns, oh my goodness, I've been watching Gunsmoke. I watched the first episode on September 10th, 1955, when I was 4. I can't say that I remember that episode from that time. Of course, I've seen it dozens of times since, now that we have modern technology with VCRs and all that kind of thing. They repeat shows all the time. But Gunsmoke was the main show that I enjoyed through all these years. And it's ironic that when I did come to Colorado, I moved to the town that Ken Curtis, Festus Hagen from Gunsmoke, grew up in. Yeah. So that's fun, talking to people that actually knew him first.
Well, let me turn to Henry Park. And by the way, Patty Sheen's website is pattysheen.com, and I'll link to that and Henry's below this video when we're done. And Henry has a blog called Henry's Western Roundup, and that's Henry's Western Roundup.blogspot.com. So Henry, let me ask a little bit about yourself and how you got into watching television westerns.
Well, I came from the opposite side of the country from Patty. I'm from Brooklyn, New York, and I just grew up watching TV like everyone else. And when I was a kid, everyone watched westerns. I've been primarily a screenwriter all my life, and the funny thing is I've never written a western, but the way that the blog actually started was I was forever finding out about events on the last day, like the last day of a John Ford Film Festival, things like that. And I thought there needed to be a central place where people could go to just find out across the country what events were happening. So I really started Henry's Western Roundup, the online report on Western film production, just to keep track of things like that. And instead, it does that, of course, but then actors in spaghetti westerns started contacting me, and it expanded. And so now we're read in about 100 countries. And I also am the film editor for True West magazine, and written a couple of movies that have been made, but sadly not westerns. But hopefully that's around the corner.
Yeah. Well, let me ask. Let me just start with Patty. Patty, you are mainly a Gunsmoke fan, but did you watch any other westerns besides Gunsmoke when you were young?
Oh, absolutely. I watched Cheyenne and Bonanza and the Virginian and Rawhide, and goodness, I'm sure there were a bunch of others that I watched. And And I want to clarify for your listeners that I don't really have much of a blog on my website about Gunsmoke. In fact, I was surprised when you contacted me. I have a small area on my website called Gunsmoke Obsession, and I really need to work on that because I see where I haven't added much to it for a long time.
Yeah. Well, what drew you to westerns, Patty, rather than say FBI or the Untouchables or Gangster or other Superman with George Reeves? What was it about westerns that drew your interest as a child?
I think the thing about westerns, Dan, is that the characters are larger than life characters. They overcome the most stringent of adversities. I think they represent the American story, general, how the first pioneers struggled so hard to expand this country. And I think about some of the things that these people went through, and we talk about the good old days, but I'm not so sure that they were all that good. We had to live that way today.
Yeah.
How we in our society, modern technology would handle it. But I think it's just the fact that there was a certain ethic to these people. They had courage. They had a sense of honesty. They had a sense of survival. They were faithful to their God. They were very devout. And to me, it's just an admiration for that whole generation of people.
Well, let me turn to Henry and ask you the same question. What drew you to watching westerns on television rather than, say, the Perry Masons and the other TV detectives kind of shows?
I think I did watch a lot of Superman. I got to say, I was a big George Reeves fan, but it was not a tremendous amount of realism to that. It was the charm of the people over the material, but really, I think it was Roy Rogers and the Lone Ranger that really hooked me. I just, to this day, I can always put on an episode of Roy Rogers, and I really think he's a much better actor than people give him credit for because he's so natural.
Mm-hmm.
But it was essentially, I think, him and Clayton Moore, and then branching out from there. And, of course, with the family, I've been watching Gunsmoke and Bonanza and shows like that at night. My sister was a particular fan of Maverick, so I'd see those with her. Actually, I remember one of the real surprises to me, because I'd grown up watching the Gunsmokes of the late 60s and into the 70s. And I remember as a kid, the first time I saw one of the half-hour Gunsmokes, because the first 6 seasons were half-hour, and I was just stunned because it was like film noir western. It was so much tougher and grittier than the series became. Not to put down the rest of the series, but it was really, Philip Marlowe out west.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because one of the reasons for doing this is in the last year, one of those new sort of oldies television networks called, I think it's a Cozy TV, or no, it's not Get TV, a Me TV, I think, here in the Austin, Texas area where I live, started replaying things like The Big Valley and The Rifleman and also Gunsmoke. And for the first year or so, they just had the 1 hour Gunsmokes in black and white with Festus. And then they just this year in January started with the first Gunsmoke, the half-hour ones. And I do remember too, I was born in '65, I do remember too when I was 5, 6, 7, seeing some Gunsmokes and thinking, it's kind of boring. It's a bunch of old frauds going around doing stuff. And then when I saw the black and white ones with Festus, the hour-long ones, and also with Burt Reynolds, and then just recently the early Gunsmokes, I thought it was much more interesting. The early half-hour ones start out with, at least the first few seasons, with James Arness wandering around this Boot Hill, and he gives a little monologue to open each show. And it does give that sort of film noir kind of feeling to it. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But let me just let's start with the beginnings of westerns on television. It seems to me, from all I know, that a lot of the westerns early on in the late 40s, early 50s were the B films that came on as repeats, as well as radio shows that became, like Gunsmoke started out on radio shows that became television shows. Was there any, I'll start with you, Henry, since you are more of a historian of the genre. What was the first really big Western hit? Was it The Lone Ranger?
I believe before The Lone Ranger was Hopalong Cassidy.
Yeah.
The story of, do you know the story of William Boyd and how he got the control of the character of Hopalong Cassidy?
No, go ahead, tell us.
Okay, Clarence Mulford wrote the books and created the character, and William Boyd had, in the early talkie days and the silent movie days, he had a pretty good career being in movies for DeMille and people like that. And then his career got ruined in the early 30s by coincidence. Another actor named William Boyd got arrested at a drug orgy. And when it was reported in newspapers, they ran the pictures of, the white-haired guy, that, we know as Hopalong Cassidy, William Boyd. And he became unemployable for a couple of years, even though everyone knew it was not really him. But that was the picture that had gone out. Then in the the mid-30s, he got hired to play Hoppy. Now, the interesting thing was the man who created Hopalong Cassidy, Clarence Mulford, when he sold the rights to the character to make movies to Paramount, he had this weird thing in the contract that said that he retained electronic reproduction rights. And nobody knew what it was. And I said, well, what is that? To put the movies on radio? They said, well, whatever it is, give it to him. But when television came along, then electronic reproduction rights had an actual meaning. And so Mulford owned those. And when Boyd had played Hopalong Cassidy till, there was no more interest in making the movies, he sold his house or mortgaged his house and raised every bit of money he could and bought from the Mulford estate the rights to Hopalong Cassidy's movies. And so he put them on television, and they ran like crazy, were very popular, and after that, he started doing his own series of new episodes. Uh-huh. So I think he was probably the first of the hits, with The Lone Ranger coming not from television, not from film, but from radio, about the same time, right after.
Now, from what I'm looking at, just looking at a list, it seems that the first Westerns were more aimed at children in the early 50s, as a lot of television shows were. You had, was it Captain Video and the Video Rangers? A lot of these early hits were aimed specifically at television. Was that because it was difficult, do you think, to get actors to go on TV? Because TV was seen sort of as the smaller cousin to film.
Oh, yeah, I know that, for instance, Gene Autry got into terrible trouble with a lot of his theater people because they said, if you start doing a TV show, then no one will pay to see you in the movies, and we're going to, we're stuck with these contracts to run movies that no one will want to see. Mm-hmm. And he had to approach them saying, every episode of the Gene Autry show is a half-hour commercial for my movies. Yeah. So, but yes, originally the big appeal of Westerns on TV were the kid shows, that Roy Rogers, Gene Autry, Hopalong Cassidy, The Lone Ranger.
Uh-huh. Well, let's talk then about Gunsmoke in the mid-50s, because it looks like the mid-50s was when a lot of, I guess you would call, the iconic shows of the West appeared, including Maverick, Gunsmoke, The Rifleman, and a little bit later you got Bonanza and The Virginian. Let me just turn to Patty, since she's the big fan of Gunsmoke. You said that you remember the first time you saw the first Gunsmoke episode. Was your family also similarly into Westerns? Were you watching Westerns previous to that, or did you just happen to flip on the channel, see that, and get hooked?
Dan, I was only 4 years old, so I really don't remember. Yeah. I just remember, and like I say, it's probably because I have seen that first episode since, that it really sticks in my mind. And of course, the amazing thing about that first episode for Western watchers, and Gunsmoke has been pretty much listed as the Western that brought in the adult Westerns. Correct me if I'm wrong there, Henry, but I believe from some of the research books I have that that's what they say. But viewers were absolutely shocked when in that first episode, the hero, Matt Dillon, is shot.
Yeah.
He loses his first gunfight. So that was very appealing, I think, to viewers, because it's like, wow, this Western's going to be a little different. Sometimes the good guy doesn't always, he comes out on top in the end, but he has to go a ways to get there. So I think that was part of the appeal of the show.
Yeah. Also, a year or two later came the Rifleman, and both Connors, Chuck Connors, who played the Rifleman, and James Arness were these really huge guys. I mean, they were both like 6'5", 6'6", something like that. Yeah. Do you think that had an appeal to? Let me start with Patty, and then I'll ask Henry. Do you think that had a sort of appeal, that they were clearly the stars of the show because they towered over everyone else?
Absolutely, and I'm sure you know the story, Dan. And I'm sure Henry knows the story that actually John Wayne was asked to play that part.
Yeah,
right.
And
anyone that probably ever watched Gunsmoke knows that.
Yeah.
And he referred the show to Jim Arness, and Jim basically said, "I don't want anything to do with that. I don't want to do TV. I want to be in movies." And John kind of told him, he said, "If you don't take this opportunity, you're crazy, because this is going to make you." And of course, it was right. It made his career.
Yeah.
Jim Arness's career.
Go ahead, Henry. Let me just ask you about that. People like Connors and James Arness were unknowns before that, and like Patty said, he was reluctant to take the job. Do you think that that once something like Gunsmoke became established, and I think for 4 or 5 years it was the #1 show in the late 50s, early 60s, that helped establish television as a whole, not just Westerns, but television as a whole, for actors of quality to want to come and do series?
Oh, absolutely. It was, as a matter of fact, as Patty was saying, John Wayne not only encouraged or really shoved Jim Arness into it, he did an introduction on the first episode and essentially said, "You better watch."
Yeah.
But it is interesting. There was always the problem, the stigma of, if you act on television, will you then be able to go back to movies, or will people think, well, you're nothing, I can get you for free? I was talking to the producer of the show The Rebel, if you remember that one, with, Nick Adams. And he told me that for the first episode, he hired both Agnes Moorehead and John Carradine. The reason was, even though they got more money than TV episode actors generally did, he said he was going to put such good actors into the show that nobody would turn it down after that, saying, "Well, I don't do television."
Mm-hmm.
So the stature of the actors, in terms of career, was important, but as you're saying too, also height. When you look at all the Warner Brothers shows, Bronco and Cheyenne, you look at Ty Hardin and Clint Walker. These guys they're all mountains like John Wayne. They're all huge, imposing, and beautiful guys who frequently take off their shirts.
Well, in the first few years of Gunsmoke and also The Rifleman and most of the other TV Westerns, they were half-hour shows. And when you think about it nowadays, I can't remember the last dramatic show, Western or not, that was a half hour. It's like all half-hour shows these days are sitcoms or game shows, and hour-long shows are all dramas. Even early on, there were a few spy shows that were half hours. By the early 60s, though, almost all dramas became hours. Let me ask both of you, what do you think was the advantage of the half-hour format and the disadvantage for especially for Westerns? Patty, do you think there was any dramatic change from, say, Gunsmoke and some of these other early shows that were half hours when they started, then expanded to an hour?
I would have to say that I would agree that half-hour shows seem to be more action-packed, I think the hour shows allowed the writers more time to develop relationship between the characters. And that, to me, was the main premise of Gunsmoke. That is why that show was so beloved. Because those characters were like a family. And every week they came into your living room and you felt like you were a part of that family. The relationship between, for example, Doc and Festus is something that is just about unparalleled. I mean, it was amazing the way the writers had those characters play off of each other throughout the show. There was the humor, there was the drama, there was all the emotion of that very deep friendship among all of them. Then, of course, there was always that tension between Matt and Kitty, the romance that never really happened, that everybody kind of wanted to happen, and yet it was kind of refreshing that you never saw anything really on screen, which, of course, is the complete opposite of what you see today.
Yeah. Henry, how
But
about...
to answer your question, Dan, I think that the relationship was able to be more deeply developed in the hour shows, the character relationships.
What is your comment on the half-hour versus hour westerns?
The half-hour shows were good. Like I said, they were pretty well action-packed. You had to get your story crammed into a very short period of time, so it had to be a little bit more intense at times. And I like both, so it's hard to, I can't say that I favor one over the other.
How about you, Henry? What's your comments about half-hour versus an hour?
Well, given the choice, I would watch a half hour over an hour. I liked the hour and the half hour Gunsmokes, but I like the half hours better. Big fan of Have Gun Will Travel. You mentioned the Rifleman, and I think that's an interesting case because that was always a half hour, and that was a relationship show too between Pa and the son. And the difference between that and say Gunsmoke or Bonanza or any of the hours is simply there were less characters involved. But I always sort of preferred when I was more interested in plot than character, I guess is what it comes down to. So I just thought the half hours were a lot tighter. But then again, I understand very much, like with Gunsmoke, they had to do something because they were essentially running out of plots, and they realized that they had to spend more time on character and bring more characters from the outside in. And of course, that was the real pattern as the show got longer. It became less and less about Matt. And often you would see him at the beginning say, Chester or Festus, I'm going to go serve some warrants, and you take care of the town. And in the end, he'd ride in and find out how Morgan Woodward got killed.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, that's actually not true. Matt always killed Morgan himself.
I know that especially in the early versions of Gunsmoke and something like The Rifleman, you got a lot of, I guess you'd call them cliches in that, for example, even though Matt was shot in the first episode, he comes back and kills the bad guy. You get the bad guy almost always announcing, I'm going to kill you, Marshal. In The Rifleman, you get a similar thing. You get little Johnny Crawford, who played the son. He does something stupid, or a friend of his does something stupid, and Dad comes in right away to save him. Do you think that in a sense, they become almost, those kinds of cliches make these mythic situations rather than realistic? So what is your take on a lot of the cliches? Do you think, for example, that it would have been more interesting had a major character actually been killed, like if Chester, I think he just left the show and was replaced by Festus. They never explained why. If they had him killed off by, say, Johnny Smith, the bad guy, would that have been added more realism to the show, to show the characters actually grieving? Because oftentimes you'd see they'd introduce someone at the beginning of a show as if he's always been there. He'd end up getting killed, and then by the next episode, no one ever mentions him again. Let me start with you, Henry. Go ahead. Henry, if you want to...
Did you ask for me or Henry? I'm sorry.
Let me start with Henry, then you, Patty.
Okay. There is the problem of each of the episodes has to stand alone as its own movie. And so you sort of will accept that people can be brought in that you've never seen before, and then everyone's acting like they know them. But there is the effect of when you see them time after time. Actually, much as I love The Rifleman, it drove me nuts after a while that every week some other fast-talking, charming guy would come into town, and poor Johnny Crawford would fall for him again, and his dad would have to kill him. And so it does create a problem of realism when you see, situation after situation repeated. On Bonanza, Marriott Hartley told me that she had a romance with every son in, over the seasons, and eventually had one with Lauren Green, with Pa, and always playing different characters. But she said that after she had done the one with Lauren Green, he got a very angry letter from a fan who said, "For goodness sake, Green, couldn't you tell that's the same woman that almost tricked Adam into marrying her?"
Yeah.
So there is that problem of the buildup of familiarity and the problem of falling into these cliche patterns.
Yeah. How about you, Patty? What is your take on these sort of Western cliches?
It's interesting that you should bring that up, Dan, because I remember in my teen years when we were still watching Gunsmoke, and of course then the soap operas were also popular, so we were watching a couple of the soaps as well. And I remember one of the main characters on one of these soap operas was killed off. Yeah. And us being all shocked, that they would actually kill off a main character, and my dad making the comment that, yeah, the thing is with your Westerns like Gunsmoke, Matt is going to be there always, no matter what happens to him, how many times he gets shot, he's going to be there that next week. Another thing that always bothered us Gunsmoke fans, we used to be involved in a group where there were a bunch of us, and we would always do a message thing. Unfortunately, I've kind of lost touch with them. But it always bothered us that, when a character left the show, you hardly ever heard about them again. Yeah. When Dennis Weaver left, there was no reference to him.
Yeah.
I think in one show, years and years later, there was a reference that he had served on a jury. But I mean, as far as what happened to him, they never wrote anything into the story as to what happened to those characters when they left Dodge City.
Yeah.
Winchester was another one, played by
Burt Reynolds.
Very famous.
Burt Reynolds.
I can't even think of his
Burt Reynolds. Now. Burt Reynolds.
Yeah, Burt Reynolds. Good grief. Sorry about that, Dan. But, you just never heard, they just never wrote into the script what happened to these characters. Kitty Russell, for crying out loud, Amanda Blake, she wasn't in the 20th season.
Yeah.
I don't know if you all knew that, but she was not in the 20th season, and there was never, this character had been on that show for 19 years.
Yeah.
So that was one thing that was kind of weird.
Another thing, too, and Henry had mentioned it, you get really the same actors playing different characters, sometimes 2 or 3 times in a season. Just watching some of these old Gunsmokes over the last year, I think I've seen at least 5 or 6 episodes with Jack Elam in it, and he's always playing some kind of a bad guy. Then around Christmas time, they played a Christmas episode on Gunsmoke, and Jack Elam played some guy who tried to hijack some orphans away from some nasty old biddy who ran a school. Do you think? I mean, you can accept on an episode by episode basis, but I would think watching it would get awfully frustrating. You'd say, "Wait a minute." Are there triplets? Are there quintuplets running around the West? Just going around, and every one of them's a psychopath.
That really didn't bother me back at the time, and it still doesn't. I've had a couple of incidents here recently where I see somebody on one show and then they're on another show, and it just doesn't bother me. I just realize that they're actors and they're just playing a part. I guess it just doesn't faze me.
How about you, Henry?
Well, as a matter of fact, it's funny because I talked to. Do you know Morgan Woodward? He's a very scary guy, and he told me that they had a rule on Gunsmoke and on most series that if you were a guest, you could not appear on more than 1 episode per season, simply because they didn't want this kind of confusion.
Yeah.
And so he was on more episodes of Gunsmoke than any other guest actor, and he was the second number of Wagon Trains. But once they let him do 2 in a season, but that was really against the rules. The difference, of course, now is we can see probably 14 episodes of Gunsmoke a day. So you're seeing all of these seasons compressed. So it would not be as obvious originally as it is now that, my God, there's Strother Martinell, Hugh Jones again.
Yeah.
Yeah, remember, Dan, back in the day, you were watching this only once a week.
Yeah.
Because we didn't have VCRs and things like that.
Yeah.
In fact, back when I was watching it, I thought, this is the last time I'm ever going to get to see this show. So, I mean, I had no concept of what technology was going to do in the future. So, I mean, I would just do anything to avoid missing an episode of Gunsmoke. I would beg out of going out with my family somewhere for fear they weren't going to get home in time to watch Gunsmoke that night. So, just keep that in mind that, like Henry said, you can't sit and watch 10 episodes in a day. You couldn't do that back then like you can now, so you don't realize it as much. Same actors appeared.
Yeah, let me talk about, with the success of shows like Gunsmoke and then The Rifleman, from what I'm reading, the peak year for Westerns on television was 1959. And it seems that that's the year when Westerns diverged into 2 types of Westerns on television. And you can tell me if I'm wrong. It seems first there came the family Western, Bonanza being the obvious and longest example. Then you'd have shows like The Virginian, and you ended up with the Big Valley, where you're following people on a ranch the whole time. And then you also had sort of what you would call, I guess, adventure westerns with things like Maverick, Have Gun Will Travel, A Wagon Train, and Wanted Dead or Alive, where every show, the lead protagonist might be in Colorado one week, the next week he's in Arizona, and he's following there are different stories. Was the glut of westerns, do you think, made it necessary to have those 2 really separate types, the sort of the family or ranch-based western, and then the lone wanderer who's going around having adventures? Let me start with you, Henry.
Well, I think what people just eventually realized was that both shows had they're both styles of shows had their own advantages. The thing about the loner, the single guy, is a really standard appeal in westerns of the story of the lone individual. But what was the great advantage of the family westerns, Bonanza, the Big Valley, High Chaparral, was, and also the Virginian, which really mixed up both, because you had the big focus on the Virginian, and you had the judge's family. And the thing is, there was somebody for everyone to watch. If you watched Bonanza, if you were a kid, you were probably most interested in Haas. If you were a teenager, you were interested in Little Joe. If you were older, somewhere between Adam and Ben. And if you look at the Big Valley, you've got the same thing. You've got Lee Majors instead of
Little Joe.
And so, but there's an equivalent character.
Yeah.
Same thing with High Chaparral. There was always somebody amusing for the little guys and somebody mature for the adults, and broken up in between. So I think it was really a way of just trying to bring in a whole family audience.
Yeah. How about
probably why they're on Sunday nights.
Yeah. How about you, Patty? Other than Gunsmoke, did you prefer, say, the sort of family or ranch-based westerns, or did you watch some of the things like Have Gun Will Travel? Did you prefer one type or the other?
I don't remember Have Gun Will Travel so much. I remember Rawhide, Wagon Train, and Cheyenne, and what's one of the Chuck Connors that we talked about? The Rifleman, Big Valley, Virginian. I remember, I guess just because it was a Western, I loved it. So I just enjoyed them all. I was fascinated with horses and cattle and wide open spaces. Of course, growing up out on Long Island, I always thought we need to live in a place where you could look out the window and see for miles, which how I can kind of do where I did. So,
Let me talk about Bonanza for a while, because other than Gunsmoke, Bonanza is sort of the archetypal Western. Didn't run quite as long. It only ran for 14 seasons, but it probably had the most famous, certainly Western TV theme song. You know, Bonanza. Yeah. What did that actually come on in color? Was that one of the first color shows, or did that have a black and white season to begin with?
I don't remember it having black and white. Do you, Henry?
I'm quite sure it started in color from the start. That and the Virginian were the big color shows.
And was that originally Bonanza a full hour?
Yes,
I think that started.
Yeah. So I know.
You know, it's
go ahead.
If I could just interject something.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was about the value of color. When you look back at the shows that have run a very long time, we're recently now starting to see the Gunsmokes that were in black and white, but they didn't show them for years. They didn't show Rawhide, which is a wonderful show for years. But the few shows that started out in color, like The Lone Ranger and like The Cisco Kid, both of which were shot at a time when they couldn't even broadcast color. Those went on in reruns forever and ever because people just got unwilling to watch black and white. It just sort of struck me as interesting that has kept them going for so long. Of course, then it became a very big deal with big shows like The Virginian and Bonanza, where they really took advantage of the color and the broad vistas and such.
Bonanza, I know, also, like Gunsmoke, I think had 2 or 3 seasons where it was the top-rated show in the early '60s. Let me ask, what do you think was the major difference between Gunsmoke and Bonanza? If I look at those as sort of the two twin towers of as the longest running shows, other than the fact that one was based with a family, was one show, do you think, grittier? Was one show, do you think, more socially conscious? Because usually when I've talked with people who are TV Western fans, most of them either favor Gunsmoke or Bonanza when they talk about the best TV Westerns of all time. They're probably the two longest running ones, and people who are real Bonanza diehards tend to not particularly have liked Gunsmoke and vice versa. Let me start with you, Patty. Why, I would assume you favor Gunsmoke over Bonanza. What is the reason for that?
I think Gunsmoke, and maybe Bonanza did too. You know, I don't have as much memory of Bonanza because I'm such a Gunsmoke fan. Gunsmoke dealt with a lot of the social issues that we even deal with today. And a prime example, they won some kind of an award, I can't recall what it was, but it was award for one of their shows. It was called Fires of Ignorance. And it dealt with compulsory education. But throughout the years, Gunsmoke dealt with issues of, like I say, that we're dealing with today, you know, robbery, greed, maintaining a reputation, even things that are really even grittier, like domestic abuse, sexual assault. You know, they dealt with things like that on Gunsmoke. It was maybe more subtle, but it was obvious that that was the topic of the particular show. That was the main premise of what had happened on the show. So, and like I say, I don't want to be unfair to Bonanza because I don't have that much recollection of it. I just remember I really thought Adam was the greatest character on the whole show. And he wasn't on there. I was disappointed. And the other guy I really liked was Candy. David Canary. Just loved him. And he wasn't on there near as much as I would like to have seen him on there. So I don't know if I answered your question appropriately there, Dan.
Yeah. How about you, Henry? Of those two shows, just to start with them, did you favor one or the other, or did you appreciate elements of both?
Well, I definitely appreciated elements of both, but probably I watched quite a bit more of Gunsmoke than Bonanza. I think Bonanza had kind of written themselves into a corner just in the sense of they didn't want to change the dynamic. So you always knew when a girl came in and got involved with one of the sons, that she was either going to die young or be some sort of a swindler, but you knew she was never going to be seen again. And whereas in Gunsmoke, because they would have stories built around characters that we haven't seen before, and as we're saying, wouldn't see again, anything could happen. They could live happily ever after, or murder each other, or anything you want. And you had the sort of unreality of, like, which is why Cornell Roberts left. He said, "I'm a 40-year-old guy living with my dad and doing everything he tells me, and yet I'm supposed to be this big, smart, macho guy." And I think that's one of the reasons that David Dortort, who created Bonanza, would go on to create a High Chaparral, because he wanted to do a show about a dysfunctional family.
So
it was a big switch.
Well, by the mid-'60s, with the popularity, it seemed that there was a lot of more experimentalism with the formats. For example, this even goes back earlier to the late 50s. I think 59 was when Maverick came on, and that had Jim Garner. And Garner, I think, is one of the greatest TV actors in American history, with that and the Rockford Files. There you had them making fun of a lot of the Western conventions. He would sometimes speak directly to the camera, breaking the fourth wall. As a boy, for example, one of my favorite shows, it only ran for 2 seasons, was the spoof comedy F Troop, which I thought was hilarious. And then I'm thinking in the late 60s too, I remember as a very young boy, I remember the Wild Wild West with, what's the guy, Conrad, the knock the battery off my shoulder fella. He was the guy, it was a mixture of science fiction, what they now call sort of steampunk, where he played, I think, a Secret Service agent who went out west to have all kinds of adventures, and he'd encounter UFOs and Bigfoot or whatnot. What is your memory of those kinds of shows? I'll start with Henry first. Did the Westerns need that sort of invigoration so that they didn't get stale, so that shows like Maverick or Wild Wild West, what purpose did they serve?
I think it's just as you're saying there. You talked about what was the year 59 that people said it was the greatest year of Westerns, but it was an excessive year of Westerns, and there's only so many ideas that you can have. There's a great deal of repetition, hello, Dodger. And as a result, they really tried to broaden things, and so you had shows like the Wild Wild West, like Laredo, which were both very interesting shows with absolutely no relation to history at all. Yeah. But they were also, of course, trying to be very hip at a time when, in the 60s, this was the time of the Beatles and, rebellion, and kids probably did not want to watch the shows that their parents wanted to see. I think it was unique here, and I think this sort of irreverent comedy was sneaking into it. And I loved F Troop too, by the way. Wonderful show. Yeah. Holds up beautifully.
Patty, how about you? Did you watch any of these more experimental westerns, like Maverick or Wild Wild West?
Yeah, I can remember watching Maverick, and I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed James Garner. Wild Wild West, I probably just watched a few episodes of that, but I remember one that was called The Hero, and I can't remember when it came out, but it was kind of, if I remember correctly, it was kind of a story about these characters filming a Western, and it was really spoofy. And for example, I can remember one scene where, you know how they used to slide the beers down the bar? Yeah. The guy would catch his beer? Yeah. Well, they had to film that scene like 16 times because the guy kept missing the beer, and it would just slide off at the end of the bar. And, I can just remember it being a really silly show about filming a TV Western and all these stupid things that happened. And that was kind of fun, but I certainly didn't classify it as your vintage Western like the ones that I enjoyed, like my Gunsmoke and Ryan Tree and those types of things.
I know, let me just move on a couple of years. I think it was in 67, I think, Gunsmoke was going to be canceled. And then I guess the wife of the guy who owned CBS, or the head of CBS, William Paley's wife, said no, Gunsmoke was her favorite show, and so they ended up canceling Gilligan's Island instead, which is probably the best thing that ever happened to Gilligan's Island, because you had that limited run of shows where they never get off the island. Let me just ask you, Patty, because you probably know about it. Was that basically true, or is that just a made-up story?
No, that's in one of the books I have. Yeah, I'd forgotten about that story, Dan, but you're right. Yeah, that they, I forget who it was that, I was thinking that there were several letters written in, but no, you're right. It was somebody's wife that said, "Oh no, you're not canceling this show. This is my favorite show." Yeah. And I wish I could access that story. I've got the book right here next to me. I wish I could access that story, but this book is so thick that I'd never find it. Yeah. But yeah, I can't remember the exact details, but you're right. There was somebody that was kind of in a high place that said, "No, you're not canceling this show."
Go ahead, Henry.
I thought actually that Haley himself was a fan of the show and was on vacation and came back, and whoever he had left in charge of production had redone the schedule and pulled off Gunsmoke.
Yeah.
That might be too, Henry. It's been so long since I've read through this book that you might be right.
Let's talk about, I guess, what we'd call sort of the decline years, the late 60s. And when I first rewatched The Big Valley, I remember watching that as a very small boy, and I remember Lee Majors, who then, I remember when he became the $6 Million Man. But I watch that now, and to me that just doesn't hold up. It's sort of like a sappy soap opera. Even from the very beginning, it's so predictable. Barbara Stanwyck always has the wise words. Linda Evans is like a total airhead throughout the whole show. She doesn't say a smart thing throughout the whole thing. You have the one brother, the middle brother, who's always a jackass. And then you have the older brother who went on to Nanny and the Professor. He's always wise. And Lee Majors is really the only character that I can actually say I like from the show, because he had a little bit of unpredictability. He was the outsider. Do you think that a show like Big Valley was sort of the beginning of the end? Because it seems that's a show that didn't really have any new ideas in it. Henry, if you want to go first.
Well, I think I must have been a bigger fan of the show than you, because I rather enjoy The Big Valley.
Yeah.
But I know what you mean. By the time of The Big Valley, just as there had simply been a glut of westerns in the late 50s, by the time of The Big Valley, you had a glut of these family stories.
Yeah.
And it just, you run out of ideas. And as you say, they had, Nick was the tough one, and Jared was the smart one, and Heath was the one who flew off the handle. The weird thing is that the most interesting stuff of the show disappeared so early, because the whole story with Lee Majors, when his character Heath gets there, he's the illegitimate son of Mr. Barkley. I forget his first name, who you never see, but one that Stanwyck was married to. And in the first episode, Linda Evans tries to seduce him, not knowing that he's supposed to be her half-brother, to get control of it. I mean, it started out with some really pretty edgy stuff, and unfortunately, as you say, they run out of ideas.
Yeah. How about you, Patty? What do you think
I can remember watching The Big Valley, and I kind of liked it. Unlike you, Henry, I kind of liked the story, but I just don't remember as much about, like I say, Gunsmoke is the main one that I still watch today, so to try and remember individual episodes of these other shows is very difficult for me. I just don't remember. Years ago I watched them, and I remember enjoying them at the time, or I wouldn't have bothered to watch them.
Yeah.
But as far as the dynamic of that show, I don't even remember those male characters you talked about. I just remember Barbara Stanwyck and Linda Evans. So there you go.
Well,
of course, I'm getting old too, remember.
Yeah.
My retention is not as good as it was 20 years ago.
Well, let's end this segment. In the next segment, I want to talk about sort of the 1970s through now, and the decline of westerns on television, and we'll do that when we return. I'm speaking with Patty Sheen and Henry Park about television westerns on American television. So we get to say around 1970, and I know there was what was referred to as the Great Rural Purge in the early 70s, where a lot of rural-based shows were basically stripped from the schedule, and this included things like Mayberry RFD and those kinds of shows that weren't Green Acres, that weren't really westerns. And it seemed to me that as a young boy, I remember a lot of the 1970s, the few quote-unquote westerns that remained. I mean, Bonanza, I think, lasted till 73, Gunsmoke till 75. But of the remaining westerns, they seemed to get fewer and farther in between, and they got more broad. I remember William Shatner had a television show where he was in the West, the Barbary Coast, I think it was called. Then there was, in the early 70s, Kung Fu with David Carradine, as a half Chinese guy wandering the Old West, I think looking for his brother or something like that. And by the late 70s, you had shows like Little House on the Prairie, which I guess you could technically say was a Western. It was based upon a famous book where a family of homesteaders, I think it was in Minnesota or Iowa, are out there. And probably for me, the last show that I recall from my boyhood that could be classified as a Western was Grizzly Adams, which really was sort of like an environmentalist Western. Here's a big mountain man who's being hunted for a crime he didn't commit. He meets, he saves a grizzly bear cub. He becomes friends with an old miner and a local Indian. Let me start with you, Henry. By the 1970s, do you think that the whole Western genre was just running out of steam? And why, if so, why do you think that was?
Well, I think there were two major issues. One was the influence of spaghetti westerns. If you look at the last season of The Virginian, they changed the name from The Virginian to The Men from Shiloh. They got Ennio Morricone to do a new theme. They tried to make it look like a spaghetti western because that was where young people were going. Yeah. They were going to see the Clint Eastwood pictures and things like that. And that only lasted the season. And the problem there was the other thing that was going on was a reaction against what people thought was too much violence on television. I got to talk to both Henry Darrow from I Chaparral and Darby Hinton from Daniel Boone. And they both told me essentially the same story, which is that they started cutting out any kind of action, any kind of violence. If you can't shoot anybody, if you can't have a fist fight, if you can't hit anyone with a bottle, what can you do? So the shows got more and more talky, and the ones that tried to be more action-oriented, as I said, tried with the sort of spaghetti western influence, didn't last. And I think that's what really killed it, is you go to a Western for action, and that was just drained out of there. Mm-hmm. So I think that was really what led to the ultimate demise of the genre on TV.
How about you, Patty? By the time Gunsmoke ended, were you still watching Westerns in the 1970s, the few that were on?
I don't know that I was, Dan, because back then I was kind of going back to school and involved in work and everything like that. So I don't know that I was really that much, had the time for TV. Mm-hmm. So I actually think like the 19th and 20th season, I probably saw them later on DVR. I'm not so sure that I even saw them at their first airing.
Mm-hmm. How about, Henry, say, the 1980s through now? I know very sporadically you had shows like Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman. There was another spoof show, I remember, in the early 90s called Briscoe County. Have there been any serious attempts to revive the genre? Because we see now all of these CSI police procedural shows. You see these soap operas, putting aside reality television. There seems to be, and I think now with the 21st century, especially with cable, and you have a lot more sex. If violence was the issue with westerns 30 or 40 years ago, that cable television would be a natural home for westerns to be reborn. Has that happened, and if so, why not? Let me ask you, Henry.
Well, I think it has happened on cable. I think with shows like Lonesome Dove, with Deadwood, recently with 6 seasons of Hell on Wheels, by bypassing the standards that you have to deal with on regular broadcast television about how much violence you can have. Not that those standards really exist anymore, but I think that the reason that there has been a revival of interest, the reason that Quentin Tarantino and people like him are making westerns again, what really stimulated interest was Lonesome Dove and Deadwood. So I think that there really has been a revival, and it really started there.
Have the westerns that you just spoke of, are they more realistic in a sense than the Gunsmokes and the stuff in the late 50s, early 60s, in the sense that you're going to see more violence? Will you see people acting more realistically towards one another, or are they sort of politically correct revisionist westerns where you have cowboys, for example, always being sympathetic to, let's say, an escaped slave or to an Indian tribe? Is there more realism today, or not, and for good or ill?
It's just to me, it seems to vary from show to show. I find it's like I know everyone loved Deadwood more than I did. I was not a big fan because all the stuff that folks said was so realistic. Just the amount of cursing doesn't offend me particularly, but it's the fact that they used to have fighting words where somebody said something about your mother, you killed them, and that was perfectly legal. And so I think that probably Lonesome Dove was much more realistic than we're used to. But then again, if you want to compare it to realism, what you do best to look at is going back to the original half-hour Gunsmokes, which were so much tougher than what we got years later when things got sort of sanitized. I think it's probably a return to that kind of toughness. Not that your regular audience member ever knew that today knows that earlier stuff ever existed.
Well, let me turn and start with Patty. Let's go back to the classic age of television westerns, and aside from Gunsmoke and Bonanza, are there 2 or 3 western shows, Patty, that you would recommend to people who haven't seen television westerns as shows that were, say, neglected or overlooked in their day? And what would they be? Let me start with you, Patty.
I don't know if they were neglected, but my 2, other than Gunsmoke, I'd say my next 2 favorites were The Rifleman and Cheyenne.
Yeah.
Once again, you had the really tall characters, so I think there's a point to what you brought up with that, Dan.
Yeah. Well, we've spoken about The Rifleman.
I enjoyed both of those shows.
We spoke about The Rifleman a bit, and it was mentioned Cheyenne. Patty, why don't you just give if you can, what was Cheyenne about?
Oh, gee, Clint Walker. I'm not even sure what he was. What was he, Henry? I just remember he was a Western guy.
He was a drifter, a loner.
A scout, but he was a scout for the Army or something at one point, wasn't he?
Oh, at some point, sometimes he was a lawman. It was the same.
It was just different things, yeah.
A little different every time.
Yeah.
But whatever he was, of course, he was always the good guy.
Yeah.
Always.
How about you, Henry? If you could recommend to people who, don't know anything about classic American westerns, can you name 2 or 3 shows that you think they should check out, and why?
Right. Wagon Train is a wonderful show. It had a continuing cast of people, but they always focused on a different individual or family traveling west, and those are hold up very well. So does Rawhide, where Clint Eastwood and I'm forgetting the name of the guy who was Fleming. Eric Fleming are forever moving the same herd of cattle across country. There was a wonderful writer, Charles Marcus Warren, who incidentally Samuel L. Jackson's character in Hateful Eight is named after, who was a terrific writer, and he was responsible for creating the TV version of Gunsmoke, of Rawhide, the Virginian, great storyteller, and you cannot go wrong with any of the shows that he created. The history is so strong, and the writing and characters are so good. Another really interesting thing that has not been seen for years and years and just became available is a show called Loner, starring Lloyd Bridges, which was created by Rod Serling. It only ran for one season. There's not quite 40 episodes. They've all just been put out on DVD by Shout Factory, I think it is.
Huh.
And it's a fascinating show. It's a drifter who was an officer in the Civil War. It all takes place in just 6 months after the war, and it's a character who would now be described as having post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah.
And just terrific stuff. And it's funny to think that Serling did this because he didn't think Twilight Zone would last more than a season. He wanted that stuff ready.
Yeah, I was going to actually mention that. So it was the Lona. I seem to remember, and let me just ask you, Henry, since you have studied this. I remember as a young boy, and maybe I'm wrong, but there was a Western show in the late 60s or maybe around 1970 with a guy named Robert Lansing, an actor named Robert Lansing. Do you remember a show? I think it was a similar kind of premise. He was wandering through adventures. Does that ring a bell to you, Henry?
Very vaguely, and I'm a big fan of Robert Lansing, but I can't, from 12 O'Clock High and shows like that. Actually, I saw him on Broadway a couple of times in New York, but darn it, I can't think of what that is. I have to search that up.
Yeah, let me just see here.
But,
TV career, other channels.
And the Rebel with Adams is awfully good.
Yeah.
Some of these half-hour shows we're talking about are very good. Steve McQueen in Wanted Dead or Alive are very good episodes.
Yes.
Yeah. You said Ken Adams, Henry?
Nick Adams.
Nick Adams. Okay. Yeah.
Nick Adams, yeah.
Well, let me just before we wrap things up in the final segment, let me just ask and turn back to Patty, since you're the Gunsmoke expert. You had mentioned earlier on about loving the character of Festus. I have to say, I watched the hour-long, a few dozen of the hour-long black and white ones with Festus, and I have to say, I thought Chester was a much better character. He seemed to, Festus is just so stupid in some of the episodes, whereas Chester has it can occasionally be stupid, but he's sort of realistic stupid. I take it that you prefer the character of Festus over Chester? Is that correct, Patty?
I liked them both. But the thing about Festus was he was kind of like, who was the lady that played in the Archie Bunker show?
Oh,
what was the name of that show?
Yeah, Edith, Jean Stapleton.
Edith.
Yeah.
Yeah, she acted real stupid, but she was smarter than anybody else.
Yeah.
And I think that was the case with the Festus character.
Uh-huh.
He played this dumb, bumbling person, but he was one of the smartest people as far as savvy about relationships and life and survival and things like that. So, but I have to agree. I like Dennis Weaver as well in his part, but I can't say that I don't know that I liked one over the other.
Yeah.
I just liked all the characters in Gunsmoke.
Yeah. Well, before we before I get to
if I could quick another show that we didn't mention,
go ahead.
Henry, that was very popular for a long time was How the West Was Won. And of course that was after Gunsmoke, but it starred Jim Arness, and Bruce Boxleitner, if you remember.
Yeah, that was
that was a good show.
That was in the late 70s, right? That was the late 70s. Yeah.
In fact, they filmed that out here in my town.
Oh yeah.
In Bensold Fort, which is out past me about 10 miles here, and I went out to see Jim Arness film, and Of course, it was such an exciting day, but it was years later that I actually got to meet him in person at his book signing in L.A., but I can remember getting to watch him film. I remember thinking at the time that filming must be the most boring profession in the whole world because they filmed that same segment, that same little tiny scene, oh my goodness, probably 25 times.
Yeah.
You know, either somebody would miss a line, or an airplane would fly over, or somebody would walk on the gravel that was around and would pick up on their sound system. And I mean, it was crazy. And I just remember thinking, gee, this must be the most boring profession that's there is in the whole world.
Yeah.
It was exciting to see him in action.
Well, in the final segment, I'll give you both some final thoughts about the genre Western, and we'll do that in a moment. I have been speaking about television Westerns with Patty Sheen and Henry Park. I want to wrap up the show giving you some final thoughts. Let me start with you, Patty. If you had to recommend, say, since you're the Gunsmoke expert, if you had the top 3 or 4 episodes that stick in your mind, what episodes would they be? Would you recommend for someone to look for?
Oh my goodness, Dan, there's so doggone many, I don't even know where to begin. The Wreckers was a good one. One of the very first color episodes was a good one. It was called The Jailer. One of the half-hour episodes was called The Preacher, one of my favorites.
The Preacher, was that the one with the guy?
He's what Chuck Connor starred in, actually. Again, he was opposite Jim Arness, yeah.
Oh, I thought there was an episode I saw recently with a preacher who had a daughter who was like flirting around, and the guy wanted to sort of keep his daughter a Vestal Virgin. I thought that might have been the episode you were referring to.
No, this was about a guy who, he was a preacher. He had lost his faith. He comes to town and he's pretty much made fun of. And these guys take him and they take him out in the country where they're going to kill him. And Matt comes, and Matt mainly puts his life on the line for this guy, and this guy realizes that he does have some worth and that his life is worth saving. It's been a long time since I've seen that one, but I just remember he and Chuck Connors both played an excellent part in it.
Yeah.
And let me think of some other ones. The Brothers, that was another good one. Like I say, there's so many. That Fires of Ignorance, if you want to see an episode that deals with, it was social issues at the time, the contemporary education thing. Their 2-part shows I thought were great. Island in the Desert was a good one. There was another one called Nitro, also called Tiger by the Tail. It had 2 different names. I don't know why, but it did. That was a good 2-parter. Guns of Cebola Blanca, that was the 20th season one that was really good. So I could go on. And
okay.
There's 635 episodes, so
yeah.
That's big to choose from.
Well, PattySheen.com is your website, and I'll link below that. Let me end the show with Henry. Henry, you as you studied Westerns, if you could predict out, what do you think? Do you think there will be, you mentioned a few of these cable television shows that have been on recently. Do you think that, say, in a few decades, the Western will come back on television? Or do you think that the Western, the Western myth is part of the 20th century and it'll never be as big again?
You know, I don't know if it will ever be as big as it was. Certainly, I don't think we possibly dominate television the way it did. But I think one of the interesting things you see is, excuse me, is a sort of Western attitude in more contemporary stories. And I think shows like, the recent Oscar-nominated picture, Color High Water, that really was a Western. The recent, I don't remember, it was the FX channel that ran Justified, which was a contemporary world cop show, but it was largely a Western. And, you know, I think that there is a growing audience for Westerns now. I've just seen the first 2 episodes of a terrific show that's coming to AMC called The Sun with Pierce Brosnan that I think people are going to be very impressed with. I don't think the Western is dead by any means. I think that there's a lot of good stuff being done, and that people are going to appreciate it.
Well, I asked you about neglected shows. If you had to pick the 3 or 4 sort of quintessential shows, Western shows, what would they be, Henry?
Now we're talking about series as
Yeah.
opposed to episodes.
Yeah.
Oh, I think High Chaparral is extremely good. One that nobody remembers from the '80s, from just before Dr. Quinn. Dr. Quinn, I always thought was a sort of softened version of Paradise, which is a surprisingly good Western series, and a mix of the family thing and the loner with Jane Seymour. No, not Jane Seymour. Excuse me. Australian actress. I'm sorry, I'm not coming up with her name. But there were a lot of very good things that would pop up occasionally. Really, I think the problem over the last couple of decades is most of the shows that popped up were kind of lackluster. The sort of Magnificent Seven series I was not too impressed with. I had some fun with the young writers, but it was nothing that would have lasted in the days of making classic Western.
I just looked up Paradise. Is Jenny Beck? Is that the name?
Oh, Jenny Beck is the oldest daughter.
Okay.
Diane Foreman, I think it is.
Okay.
Does that sound right?
Okay. Well, I'm looking here.
Anyhow, that's quite a good show. I don't know if it's available anywhere.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank both you and Patty. I gave her website. Your website address is henryswesternroundup.blogspot.com, and people can look at both of your works at your websites. So I want to thank you for spending some time talking about TV Westerns with me.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for inviting me.